The sun had barely kissed the horizon when Ouagadougou awakened to another day of political tension. In the heart of Burkina Faso's capital, the presidential palace stood like a fortress against the morning light, its walls echoing with the footsteps of ministers, the rustle of important documents, and the quiet conversations that shape nations. President Ibrahim Traoré moved through his morning routine with the disciplined precision that had carried him through military coups and political upheavals. At 35, he was one of Africa's youngest leaders, thrust into power not by birthright, but by the will of a people desperate for change. His rise had been meteoric, from army captain to the leader of a nation. But with great power came greater enemies. Inside the palace walls, the atmosphere buzzed with controlled urgency. Defense Minister Colonel Ouedraogo briefed him on security reports from the northern regions, where jihadist threats continued to loom. Finance Minister Madame Traoré presented economic projections that painted a picture of cautious optimism despite international sanctions. Every face around the mahogany conference table carried the weight of a nation's future. But outside those same walls, beneath the scrutinizing gaze of armed guards and behind the iron barriers that separated power from the people, an extraordinary encounter was about to unfold. She appeared like a ghost from the dusty streets of the capital, moving with the slow, deliberate steps of someone who had traveled far beyond the measure of miles. Her name was unknown, her origins a mystery, but her presence would soon shake the very foundations of the presidency. The old woman wore clothes that spoke of poverty, a faded headscarf that had once been vibrant blue, now bleached by sun and time, a traditional boubou dress with tears carefully mended with threads of different colors, leather sandals so worn that the soles had molded perfectly to her feet. In her weathered hands she carried a simple wooden walking stick, smooth from years of use, and a small brown cloth bag tied with hemp rope. To the casual observer, she was invisible, another face in the endless stream of the poor and forgotten that populated the streets of any African capital. But there was something in her eyes, a depth that suggested she carried secrets older than governments and wisdom deeper than politics. Abdul Ouagadougou, the head gate guard, had been at his post for 7 years, a tall, broad-shouldered man with the bearing of a soldier. He took his responsibilities seriously. The presidential palace was not a marketplace where anyone could wander in with grievances or requests. Security protocols were strict, procedures were clear, and his job was to ensure that only authorized personnel crossed those gates. When the old woman approached, Abdul's first instinct was dismissal. Another beggar, perhaps, or someone confused about where she was. The palace received dozens of such visitors daily, people seeking help, money, or simply hoping to catch a glimpse of power. "Grandmother," Abdul said, in the respectful tone reserved for elders, even unwelcome ones, "this is not a place for you. The palace is closed to visitors today." The woman stopped directly in front of the main gate, her eyes meeting his without flinching. When she spoke, her voice carried an authority that seemed to contradict her humble appearance. "I have come to see President Ibrahim Traoré," she said simply. "I have something for him." Abdul couldn't help but smile. In his experience, everyone had something for the president. Complaints, requests, gifts, advice. Most were turned away before they could even state their business. "Listen, Mother," he said, his tone becoming more firm. "The president doesn't receive unscheduled visitors. If you have a petition or complaint, there are proper channels. You need to go to the Ministry of Interior Affairs, fill out forms, and wait for an appointment like everyone else. The woman listened patiently, then did something unexpected. Instead of arguing, pleading, or walking away, as most people did, she moved to a large stone beside the gate, a piece of the old city wall that had been preserved when the palace was built, and sat down. "I will wait," she said. What followed was a test of wills that would become the subject of whispered conversations among the palace staff for months to come. The old woman sat in perfect stillness as the sun climbed higher and the heat began to press down on the concrete courtyard. Palace workers arriving for the day shift glanced at her curiously. Some whispered among themselves, wondering who she was and why the guards allowed her to remain, despite clearly not belonging. It was nearly 3 o'clock when Cadidia Ouattara, President Traoré's personal assistant, emerged from the palace with a folder of documents to be delivered to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Cadidia was 28 years old, sharp-minded and ambitious. She had worked her way up from a junior clerk position to become one of the most trusted members of the president's inner circle. Her relationship with President Traoré was built on mutual respect and efficiency. He valued her ability to manage his schedule, filter important information, and handle sensitive communications with discretion. She, in turn, appreciated working for a leader who treated her as an equal rather than a subordinate. As Cadidia walked toward the palace gates, she noticed the commotion. Abdul was standing with 2 other guards, clearly frustrated, while the old woman remained seated on her stone perch. "What's the situation here?" Cadidia asked, her tone professional but curious. Abdul straightened to attention. "Ma'am, this woman has been here since morning. Says she wants to see the president. Won't leave despite multiple requests." Cadidia studied the woman more carefully. There was something unsettling about the scene, not the woman herself, but the quality of attention she commanded. Despite her humble appearance, she seemed to radiate a kind of presence that made people stop and stare. "What do you want with the president?" Cadidia asked directly. The old woman rose slowly from her stone seat, supporting herself with her walking stick. When she spoke, her voice was clear and unwavering. "I carry a gift for him, and a message. That is all I can say to anyone but him." Cadidia felt a strange stirring in her chest. Intuition, perhaps, or simply curiosity. Everything about the woman's manner suggested she was neither crazy nor desperate. If anything, she seemed remarkably composed for someone who had been sitting in the sun for hours. "Wait here," Cadidia told the guards. "Don't let her leave." She turned and walked briskly back into the palace, her mind racing. Protocol dictated that she should dismiss the woman immediately. Security concerns alone should have made that decision automatic. But something, call it instinct, call it divine guidance, made her reconsider. President Traoré was in his private study reviewing intelligence reports when Cadidia knocked on the door. The room was his sanctuary within the palace, lined with books on African history, military strategy, and Islamic philosophy. A prayer rug lay in one corner, oriented toward Mecca, and the walls displayed photographs of Burkina Faso's natural beauty rather than the typical portraits of political figures. "Come in," he called, not looking up from the document in his hands. Cadidia entered and closed the door behind her. "Mr. President, there's an unusual situation at the front gate." This got his attention. In the current political climate, any unusual situation was potentially serious. "What kind of situation?" "There's an elderly woman who has been waiting since morning to see you. She's dressed like she has very little, but she says she has a gift and a message for you specifically." President Traoré set down his papers and gave Cadidia his full attention. Security has cleared her? She's been searched. No weapons, no recording devices, just a walking stick and a small bag. But, sir, Cadidia paused, choosing her words carefully. There's something different about her. I can't explain it, but I don't think she's here to waste your time. The president was quiet for a long moment. Throughout his life, he had learned to trust his instincts, and right now, something was telling him to take this seriously. Perhaps it was his Islamic faith, which taught that divine messages could come through the most humble messengers. Perhaps it was his African upbringing, which respected the wisdom of elders regardless of their material circumstances. "You think I should see her?" he said. It wasn't a question. "I think you should consider it, sir. She's not going anywhere until she delivers whatever she came to deliver." President Traoré stood and walked to his window, which offered a view of the palace courtyard. He could see the woman in the distance, still seated on her stone, apparently unbothered by the heat or the attention she was receiving. "Bring her in," he decided. "But maintain full security protocols. And Cadidia, treat her with respect. If she's traveled this far to see me, the least I can do is listen." Cadidia felt a wave of relief mixed with apprehension. "Yes, sir. Should I have her escorted to one of the reception rooms?" "No," President Traoré said, surprising her. "Bring her to my private study. If this conversation is important enough for her to wait all day, it's important enough for me to receive her properly." 20 minutes later, Abdul could hardly believe the orders he was receiving. Not only was he to escort the mysterious woman into the palace, but he was to do so with the full ceremonial respect normally reserved for visiting dignitaries. When he approached the woman with the news, she simply nodded as if she had expected nothing less. "It is time," she said, rising gracefully from her stone seat. The walk through the palace corridors was unlike anything the staff had witnessed. Palace workers stopped their conversations to stare as the procession passed, the elderly woman in her tattered clothes walking with quiet dignity between two uniformed guards, followed by the president's personal assistant. The woman seemed unfazed by the opulence surrounding her. The marble floors, the elaborate tapestries, the gold-framed portraits of former leaders, none of it appeared to impress or intimidate her. She walked as if she had always belonged in such places, her steps slow but steady, her head held high. When they reached the president's study, Cadidia knocked on the door. "Come in," came the familiar voice from within. The door opened, and President Traoré rose from behind his desk as the woman entered. He was struck immediately by her bearing. Despite her humble clothes and obvious poverty, she carried herself with a dignity that commanded respect. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," the woman said, her voice soft but clear. "Please, sit," President Traoré replied, gesturing to a comfortable chair across from his desk. "Can I offer you water? Tea? You've been waiting in the heat for hours." The woman settled into her chair slowly, placing her walking stick beside her. "Thank you, but I need nothing except your attention." President Traoré sat back down, studying his visitor carefully. Up close, he could see that despite her worn clothing, she was meticulously clean. Her hands, though weathered by age and work, were well kept. Her eyes, clear and intelligent, met his without hesitation. "I'm told you have something for me," he said gently. The woman reached into her brown cloth bag and withdrew a small wooden box. The box was clearly old, its surface worn smooth by handling, but it was intricately carved with symbols that seemed to dance in the light from the window. "This is for you," she said, placing the box carefully on the president's desk. President Traoré opened the box slowly. Inside, nestled in dark velvet, was a smooth, oval-shaped stone of pure white. Beside it lay a piece of cloth unlike anything he had ever seen. The fabric seemed to contain threads of gold that caught the light and held it. "This is the stone of mercy," the woman explained. "It comes from a sacred river in my homeland, blessed by the prayers of generations. It has a special property. When danger approaches you, when your food has been poisoned, when those around you harbor ill intent, it will change color. It will turn red as a warning." President Traoré picked up the stone, surprised by its weight and the warmth it seemed to generate in his palm. "And this cloth," the woman continued, "was woven by the hands of widows whose husbands died protecting their communities. Each thread carries their prayers for leaders who govern with compassion and wisdom." The president folded the cloth carefully, feeling its unusual texture. "These are extraordinary gifts, but why give them to me? Who are you?" The woman reached into her bag once more and withdrew a small prayer mat, woven with simple but beautiful patterns. "This is for your knees, not for power, but for surrender. When the weight of leadership becomes too heavy, when the decisions you must make seem impossible, do not turn first to your advisors or your generals. Kneel on this mat and seek guidance from the one who placed you in this position." The president was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the gravity of what he was being given. As a practicing Muslim, he understood the spiritual significance of the gifts, but there was something more here, a sense that this encounter was far from random. "You speak as if you know something about my future," he said. The woman's expression grew more serious. "I know that you are not a typical leader. You came to power not through inheritance or political scheming, but because your people needed you. That makes you dangerous to those who profit from chaos and corruption." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes intense. "Not everyone around you has clean hands or a pure heart. Some smile too quickly, some praise too loudly, some offer help while planning betrayal. One of them is very close to you." A chill ran down President Traoré's spine. "Are you warning me about a specific threat?" "She am warning you to be vigilant. The stone will guide you when human wisdom fails. Trust it and trust your prayers, but do not trust everyone who claims to serve you." The room fell silent except for the distant sounds of the palace. Footsteps in corridors, the murmur of conversations, the quiet hum of activity that never ceased in the seat of power. "Who are you?" President Traoré asked again. "Where do you come from? How do you know these things?" The woman stood slowly, supporting herself with her walking stick. "My name and my origins are not important. I was sent to deliver a message, not to be remembered. What matters is that you heed the warning and use the gifts wisely." She moved toward the door, then paused and turned back to face him. "Remember this always," she said, her voice firm with authority. "Power is a heavy burden, but it becomes dangerous when carried with pride. Stay humble, stay vigilant, and always remember that your true strength comes not from your position, but from your connection to the divine." President Traoré stood as well. "At least stay the night. Let us provide you with food and rest after your long journey." The woman smiled kindly but shook her head. "I came as I was called, and I must leave the same way. But know this, you are protected by more than just your guards and your walls. As long as you remain humble and just, Providence will watch over you." She opened the door and stepped into the corridor, leaving President Traoré alone with her gifts and a profound sense that his life had just changed in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. 2 weeks passed quietly after the mysterious woman's visit. President Traoré incorporated the stone into his daily routine, carrying it in his pocket as a reminder of her warning. The prayer mat found its place in his private study, where he used it for his 5 daily prayers. The cloth was carefully stored in his personal safe, but its golden threads seemed to glow in his memory. Life in the palace continued its familiar rhythm: cabinet meetings, diplomatic briefings, economic reviews, security assessments, the endless cycle of decisions that shaped a nation's destiny. But beneath the surface routine, President Traoré found himself observing his staff and advisors with new eyes, searching for signs of the betrayal the woman had warned him about. The first test came on a humid Tuesday morning when he was scheduled to attend a high-profile diplomatic dinner in Bobo-Dioulasso, the country's second-largest city. The event had been planned for months, a gathering of West African business leaders, foreign investors, and political figures, designed to showcase Burkina Faso's stability and attract international investment. The presidential convoy left Ouagadougou in the early afternoon, winding through the countryside that President Traoré loved: red earth dotted with baobab trees, small villages where children waved at the passing motorcade, markets bustling with the colors and sounds of daily life. This was the Burkina Faso he fought to protect and improve, far removed from the sterile world of international politics and economic summits. The diplomatic hall in Bobo-Dioulasso was magnificent, transformed for the evening into a showcase of African elegance. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables set with fine china and silverware. The guest list included ambassadors, business executives, regional politicians, and cultural leaders, all the people whose support was crucial for the country's development. President Traoré entered the hall to warm applause, dressed in his characteristic, simple but elegant style. He moved through the crowd with practiced ease, shaking hands, exchanging pleasantries, and engaging in the kind of diplomatic conversations that could determine the fate of development projects and trade agreements. The atmosphere was festive, with traditional music playing softly in the background and waiters moving gracefully between the tables with trays of local delicacies and imported wine. Everything seemed perfect, too perfect, perhaps. As the evening progressed, President Traoré found himself seated at the head table, surrounded by dignitaries and business leaders. The conversation flowed from economic development to regional security, from cultural preservation to technological advancement. He participated fully, but part of his attention remained alert to the subtle dynamics around him. It was during the main course service that he noticed the man approaching his table. Tall and well-dressed in an expensive black suit, he moved with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to important company. His face was unfamiliar, but that wasn't unusual at international gatherings where new faces were common. "Your Excellency," the man said, with a slight bow, his accent difficult to place, "I have the honor of presenting tonight's special dish, prepared specifically for you by our finest chef." The plate he carried was exquisite, traditional Burkinabe cuisine elevated to restaurant quality, with aromatic spices and artistic presentation. The smell alone was enough to make President Traoré's mouth water after a long day of travel and formal events. "Thank you," President Traoré replied politely. "It looks exceptional." As the server set the plate before him, President Traoré noticed something that made him pause. The server's hands were steady, his manner professional, but there was something in his eyes, a watchfulness that went beyond normal service attentiveness. Following an impulse he couldn't quite explain, President Traoré slipped his hand into his pocket and touched the stone the old woman had given him. The effect was immediate and shocking. The stone, which had remained cool and white for 2 weeks, was suddenly burning hot against his palm. Without showing any outward sign of his alarm, President Traoré maintained his composure while discreetly withdrawing the stone, shielding it with his napkin. The white surface had turned a deep, violent red. His heart rate increased, but his expression remained calm and pleasant. The server was still standing beside him, watching, perhaps a bit too intently, as other guests began eating their meals with obvious enjoyment. "Gentlemen, ladies," President Traoré announced to the table, his voice carrying just the right note of regret, "I must apologize. I seem to be experiencing some stomach discomfort this evening. I think it would be wise for me to avoid eating until I'm feeling better." The reaction was immediate concern from the other guests, polite expressions of sympathy, and offers to call a doctor. The server's expression flickered, just for a moment, with what might have been disappointment or frustration. "Perhaps just a small taste," the server suggested. "The chef will be devastated if you don't at least try his special preparation. I'm sure it's wonderful, but health must take precedence over hospitality. Please give the chef my compliments and apologies." He stood from the table, still maintaining his diplomatic smile, while the stone continued to burn against his palm. "If you'll excuse me, I think it would be best if I return to my hotel early this evening." The departure was handled with the same grace as his arrival, but once inside his armored vehicle, President Traoré allowed himself to examine the stone more closely. It pulsed with red light, warm to the touch, and somehow alive with warning. "Take us back to Ouagadougou," he instructed his driver. "Immediately." "Sir?" the driver questioned. "We're scheduled to stay overnight." "Change of plans. We leave now." During the 3-hour drive back to the capital, President Traoré sat in silence, holding the red stone and contemplating the implications of what had just occurred. The old woman's warning had proven accurate in the most dramatic way possible. By morning, the truth was revealed. Acting on President Traoré's discreet instructions, his security team had obtained samples of the untouched food from his plate. Laboratory analysis confirmed the presence of a sophisticated poison, a slow-acting compound that would have caused gradual organ failure over several days, making it appear to be a natural illness rather than assassination. The investigation that followed uncovered a complex plot involving the mysterious server who had disappeared from the venue before dawn, and at least 2 other individuals who had fled the country within hours of the dinner. The intended assassination had been planned weeks in advance, with the server infiltrating the catering staff under false credentials. President Traoré returned to his palace with a profound sense of gratitude and a deeper understanding of the mystical forces protecting him. The stone had returned to its normal white color, but its warning had saved his life. A month passed after the poisoning attempt, and President Traoré settled into a new level of vigilance. The stone never left his side, and he found himself consulting it before important meetings and events. It remained white and cool, offering reassurance that immediate danger was not present. His relationship with his staff had subtly changed, not from paranoia, but from a new awareness of the complex loyalties and motivations that surrounded any position of power. He watched more carefully, listened more intently, and paid attention to the small details that might reveal larger truths. Cadidia continued to serve as his personal assistant with the same efficiency and dedication she had always shown. If anything, she seemed to have taken on additional responsibilities, often staying late to ensure that his schedule ran smoothly and his communications were handled properly. President Traoré valued her service more than ever, trusting her with sensitive information and relying on her judgment in matters both large and small. It was a Monday morning in October when the second test came. President Traoré was scheduled to attend the groundbreaking ceremony for a new infrastructure project, a major road development funded through a partnership with European investors. The project represented exactly the kind of foreign investment and development that Burkina Faso needed, and his presence at the ceremony would demonstrate government support and stability to the international community. The ceremony was to take place at a construction site on the outskirts of Ouagadougou, with hundreds of attendees including government officials, foreign investors, local contractors, and representatives from various international development organizations. Security had been coordinated weeks in advance, with multiple layers of protection and careful screening of all participants. As President Traoré prepared to leave the palace that morning, Cadidia briefed him on the day's schedule with her usual thoroughness. She carried a leather portfolio containing his prepared remarks, background information on the key attendees, and a detailed timeline for the event. "The ceremony begins at 10 a.m., she explained as they walked toward the presidential motorcade. "You'll speak for about 15 minutes, participate in the symbolic groundbreaking with the lead investor, and then there's a reception with the key stakeholders. We should be back at the palace by early afternoon." President Traoré nodded, listening to her familiar, efficient tone, while instinctively reaching into his pocket to touch the stone. The reaction was immediate and more intense than ever before. The stone felt like it was on fire, burning through the fabric of his pocket. He stopped walking abruptly. "We're not going." Cadidia looked at him in confusion. "Sir?" "Turn the motorcade around. We're returning to the palace immediately." "Mr. President, I don't understand. This event has been planned for months. The investors have flown in specifically for this ceremony. The media is already on site. You can't just—" "I said we're not going." His voice carried an authority that brooked no argument. "Call the site and tell them I've been taken ill. Cancel everything." Cadidia's expression shifted from confusion to frustration. "Sir, with respect, this is not wise. These are crucial relationships for the country's development. If you cancel at the last minute without a legitimate emergency—" "I am the president," he interrupted, his voice quiet but firm. "The decision is made." The motorcade turned around, and they drove back to the palace in tense silence. Cadidia sat rigid in her seat, clearly upset by what she obviously viewed as a serious diplomatic mistake. President Traoré maintained his calm exterior, while the stone continued to burn against his palm. Once inside the palace, he went directly to his private study and closed the door. The stone, when he examined it, glowed with an angry red light more intense than he had ever seen. He placed it on his desk and knelt on the prayer mat, seeking guidance and understanding. "Allah," he whispered, "if danger truly was averted, show me. Help me understand." As he prayed, a familiar presence filled the room. He looked up to see the old woman standing in the corner, exactly as she had appeared a month earlier. Her expression was grave. "It was Cadidia," she said simply. "Today was the day. If you had gone to that ceremony, you would not have returned alive." President Traoré felt as if the ground had shifted beneath him. "Cadidia? But she's like family to me. I've trusted her with everything." "She is not evil by nature," the woman replied, "but she has been compromised. Fear and greed opened a door in her heart, and others walked through it. You must act quickly." President Traoré closed his eyes, absorbing the devastating revelation. Cadidia, who had been by his side through countless challenges, who knew his schedule better than anyone, who had access to all his communications and meetings. If she had been turned, the implications were staggering. "What am I supposed to do?" he asked. "Search her belongings. You will find what you need to find, but be careful, she may not be acting alone." When President Traoré opened his eyes again, the woman had vanished, leaving only the scent of frankincense and the weight of terrible knowledge. He called his most trusted security officers, men who had served with him since his military days, whose loyalty was beyond question. "I need you to discreetly search Cadidia's office and personal belongings. Look for anything unusual, communication devices, documents, anything that doesn't belong. Do it quietly and bring her to the secure interrogation room afterward." The officers, though clearly surprised by the order, carried out their instructions without question. 30 minutes later, they returned with a small black bag that had been hidden in Cadidia's desk drawer. Inside the bag was a sophisticated remote detonation device, completely undetectable by standard security screening. Attached to it was a note with coordinates that matched exactly the location of the groundbreaking ceremony. President Traoré stared at the device in horror. If he had attended the ceremony as planned, if he had stood at the designated spot for the symbolic groundbreaking, the explosion would have killed not only him, but dozens of innocent people, including the foreign investors whose confidence was crucial for the country's future. When Cadidia was brought to the interrogation room, her face was pale and her hands were shaking. She avoided eye contact, clearly knowing that her betrayal had been discovered. "Why?" President Traoré asked her, his voice heavy with sadness rather than anger. "I trusted you more than almost anyone. You had access to my family, my home, my most sensitive information. Why would you do this?" For hours she remained silent, her lawyer advising her to say nothing. But eventually, the weight of her actions and the intensity of the interrogation broke her resistance. "They threatened my family," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "My mother, my younger siblings, they said they would kill them all if I didn't cooperate. And they offered money, enough money to get my family out of the country to start a new life somewhere safe." "Who are they?" the interrogator pressed. "I don't know all their names. Some were local politicians who wanted you removed. Others were foreigners, I think French intelligence, but I'm not sure. They said you were dangerous to regional stability, that your independence was threatening important economic relationships." The confession continued for hours, revealing a complex web of foreign and domestic interests united in their desire to eliminate President Traoré. The plot involved multiple backup plans, alternative methods of assassination, and a sophisticated understanding of palace security and presidential routines that could only have come from someone with intimate access. As the full scope of the betrayal became clear, President Traoré felt a profound sadness. Cadidia had been more than an employee. She had been a trusted confidant, someone he had mentored and supported, someone whose family he had helped during difficult times. But she had also been willing to murder him and innocent civilians for money and out of fear. The person he had trusted most had become his greatest threat. The trial of Cadidia Ouattara became one of the most closely watched legal proceedings in Burkina Faso's recent history. The evidence against her was overwhelming. The detonation device, her recorded confession, communication records linking her to foreign agents, and testimony from multiple witnesses who had observed her suspicious behavior in the weeks leading up to the planned assassination. The courtroom was packed every day, with journalists, government officials, and ordinary citizens trying to understand how someone so close to the president could have betrayed not just him, but the entire nation. Security was tight, with armed guards at every entrance and metal detectors screening everyone who entered. President Traoré chose not to attend the trial in person, watching the proceedings from his private study through a secure video link. The pain of Cadidia's betrayal was still too fresh, too personal for public display. When Cadidia was led into the courtroom for the final day of testimony, she looked nothing like the confident, efficient assistant who had once managed the president's schedule and communications. Her face was gaunt, her eyes hollow, and she moved with the defeated posture of someone who had lost everything that mattered to her. The prosecutor, Attorney General Marie Cohn, presented the case with methodical precision. She detailed the evidence, played recordings of Cadidia's confession, and painted a picture of betrayal that shocked even seasoned observers of political intrigue. The defendant, Attorney General Cohn declared in her closing argument, was entrusted with the most sacred responsibility in our democracy, the safety and security of our elected leader. She held the life of President Traoré in her hands every day, and she chose to use that trust as a weapon against him and against all the people of Burkina Faso. When Cadidia was given the opportunity to speak before sentencing, she rose slowly and faced the judge with tears streaming down her face. "I have no excuse for what I did. I was afraid for my family, and I was tempted by money, but those are not reasons. They are just explanations for my weakness. I betrayed a man who treated me like a daughter, who trusted me with his life, and who gave me opportunities I never would have had otherwise." She paused, struggling to continue. "I know that forgiveness is not possible, and I don't ask for it. I only ask that my family not be punished for my crimes. They knew nothing about what I was doing." The judge, Chief Justice Alassane Ouedraogo, was known throughout West Africa for his integrity and wisdom. He had presided over numerous high-profile cases during his 30-year career, but few had carried the weight of this one. "Cadidia Ouattara, you have been found guilty of treason, attempted assassination, conspiracy with foreign agents, and terrorism. These are among the most serious crimes possible against the state and against the people of Burkina Faso." The courtroom was completely silent as he continued. "Your actions were not just an attack on President Traoré personally, but an attack on the democratic institutions of Burkina Faso and the will of the people who elected him. You sought to overturn through violence what could not be achieved through legal means." He looked directly at Cadidia, who stood with her head bowed. "However, the court recognizes that you were manipulated by forces beyond your control, that threats were made against your family, and that you ultimately confessed and cooperated with the investigation. These factors will be considered in sentencing, but they cannot excuse the gravity of your crimes." Chief Justice Ouedraogo paused, allowing the weight of the moment to settle over the courtroom. "You are hereby sentenced to 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole for the first 15 years. This sentence reflects both the seriousness of your crimes and the mitigating circumstances surrounding them." A collective gasp rose from the courtroom. Many had expected a death sentence or life imprisonment. Cadidia collapsed into her chair, sobbing uncontrollably. From his private study, President Traoré watched the conclusion of the trial with mixed emotions. Justice had been served, but there was no satisfaction in seeing someone he had cared about destroyed by their own choices. He touched the white stone in his pocket, grateful again for the warning that had saved not just his life, but the lives of everyone who would have been at that ceremony. The investigation that followed Cadidia's arrest revealed the extent of the conspiracy against President Traoré's government. Working with intelligence agencies from friendly nations and using the information provided by Cadidia's confession, security forces began mapping the network of individuals and organizations involved in the assassination plot. The revelations were staggering. The conspiracy reached into multiple levels of government, the business community, and even some religious organizations. Foreign intelligence agencies from at least 3 countries had been involved, each with their own reasons for wanting President Traoré removed from power. They had been working for months to destabilize his government, using a combination of economic pressure, political manipulation, and ultimately, violence. Colonel Dramani Conté, the head of national security, briefed President Traoré on the findings in a secure conference room deep within the palace. The walls were lined with photographs, documents, and connecting strings that illustrated the complex web of conspiracy. "Sir," Colonel Conté reported, "we've identified at least 12 individuals within various government ministries who were either actively participating in the plot or providing information to the conspirators. We've also uncovered financial transfers totaling over €2 million that were used to fund the operation." President Traoré studied the evidence in silence, overwhelmed by the scope of the betrayal. These weren't just political opponents or ideological enemies. These were people he had worked with, dined with, trusted with the governance of the nation. "The international connections are particularly troubling," Colonel Conté continued. "We have evidence of coordination between French intelligence services, certain mining companies with interests in our gold and uranium deposits, and political factions in neighboring countries who view your government as too independent." "What do you recommend?" President Traoré asked. "We need to move carefully but decisively. Mass arrests could destabilize the government and play into the hands of those who want to create chaos. But we can't allow these individuals to remain in positions where they can do more damage." Over the following weeks, a careful purge began. Government officials who had been compromised were quietly reassigned to positions where they could do no harm, then gradually eased out of government service entirely. Those who had committed actual crimes were arrested and charged, but in a way that minimized public disruption. The international dimension was more complex. Diplomatic protests were filed with the governments whose intelligence services had been involved, but President Traoré was careful not to escalate the situation into an international incident that could harm Burkina Faso's relationships with important trading partners. Throughout this difficult period, President Traoré found himself relying more heavily on the spiritual guidance provided by the old woman's gifts. The stone remained white during routine meetings and decisions, giving him confidence that his immediate circle was now secure. The prayer mat became even more central to his daily routine as he sought divine guidance for the complex decisions required to rebuild trust within his government. 6 months after Cadidia's trial, President Traoré was working late in his study when he felt a familiar presence in the room. He looked up from his papers to see the old woman standing by the window, exactly as she had appeared twice before. "You have learned much," she said, without preamble. "I've learned that the enemies of Africa don't always come from outside our borders. Sometimes they sit at our own tables." The woman nodded approvingly. "And what else have you learned?" President Traoré considered the question carefully. "I've learned that power attracts corruption like honey attracts flies. That trust must be earned continuously, not just given once. That the price of leadership is eternal vigilance, not just against external threats, but against the darkness that can grow within any organization." "Good," the woman said. "But there is a deeper lesson still." She moved closer to his desk, her weathered face serious but kind. "The stone I gave you, the prayer mat, the cloth, These are not magical objects. They have no power in themselves. Their power comes from what they represent: wisdom, humility, and a connection to the divine. You could have ignored the stone's warning and trusted in your security detail. You could have dismissed my words as the ramblings of an old woman, but you chose to listen to something deeper than your human understanding. "I understand," President Traoré said. "You're saying that the real protection comes from spiritual awareness, not from the objects themselves." "Exactly. And that awareness must extend beyond your personal safety to the safety of your nation. Africa is surrounded by forces that seek to exploit and control her. Some of these forces operate through violence and coercion, but others work through seduction and corruption. They offer money, power, status, security, all the things that weak souls crave." She gestured toward the window, beyond which the lights of Ouagadougou twinkled in the darkness. "Your people look to you not just for security and prosperity, but for moral leadership. They need to see that it's possible to resist corruption, to maintain integrity in the face of temptation, to choose the difficult path of independence over the easy path of submission." "But how can one man, or even one government, stand against such powerful forces?" President Traoré asked. "One man cannot, but one man connected to his people, to his ancestors, to his God. That man can move mountains. The stone warned you of danger, but your prayers gave you the wisdom to heed that warning. Cadidia's betrayal was revealed, but your integrity prevented you from using her downfall to consolidate power or eliminate political opposition." She paused, allowing her words to sink in. "This is the model Africa needs: leaders who govern through spiritual strength rather than fear, who build institutions rather than personal empires, who understand that true power comes from service rather than domination." President Traoré felt the weight of this responsibility settling on his shoulders like a mantle. "What you're describing sounds like a revolutionary concept for governance. It is revolutionary, and it is ancient. Before colonization, before foreign interference, many African societies were governed by leaders who understood that their authority came from their connection to the spiritual realm and their service to the community. What I am asking you to do is not to invent something new, but to remember something that was lost." She moved toward the door, preparing to leave as mysteriously as she had arrived. "The challenges you have faced so far are nothing compared to what lies ahead. The forces that tried to kill you will not give up. They will find new ways to attack, new weaknesses to exploit, new allies to corrupt. But if you remain connected to your source of strength, if you continue to listen to the warnings that come through prayer and wisdom rather than just through intelligence reports and security briefings, you will not only survive, but you will help birth a new model of African leadership that others will follow." "Will I see you again?" President Traoré asked. The woman paused at the door and turned back to him one final time. "You will see me in every elder who offers wisdom instead of asking for favors. You will hear my voice in every prayer you say with sincere humility. You will feel my presence whenever you choose the difficult path of integrity over the easy path of compromise. I am not one woman, President Traoré. I am the spirit of Africa herself, and I am always with those who serve her faithfully." With that, she was gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of frankincense and a sense of profound responsibility. In the years that followed, President Traoré's leadership style began to attract attention far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. His combination of pragmatic governance and spiritual grounding created a model that other African leaders studied, and in some cases attempted to emulate. The stone remained a constant companion, its warnings helping him navigate the complex world of international relations and domestic politics. It alerted him to 3 more assassination attempts, 2 major corruption scandals within his government, and several instances of foreign manipulation that could have destabilized the country. But more importantly, the spiritual discipline that the old woman had taught him transformed his approach to leadership. He began each day with extended prayer and meditation, seeking guidance not just for immediate decisions, but for the long-term direction of the nation. He instituted regular consultations with traditional elders and religious leaders, creating a council of wisdom that provided input on major policy decisions. The prayer mat saw daily use, not just during the prescribed Islamic prayer times, but whenever President Traoré faced difficult decisions. He learned to distinguish between the voice of ego, which urged him toward power and prestige, and the voice of service, which called him toward humility and sacrifice. Under his leadership, Burkina Faso began to experience unprecedented stability and growth. Foreign investment increased, but on terms that benefited the Burkinabe people rather than just international corporations. Educational opportunities expanded, healthcare improved, and infrastructure projects created jobs and improved quality of life. Perhaps most importantly, corruption began to decline as President Traoré's example of integrity filtered down through the government bureaucracy. Officials who had once expected bribes and kickbacks found themselves held to higher standards. Those who couldn't adapt to the new ethical climate were replaced by individuals who understood that public service was exactly that, service to the public, rather than self-enrichment. The international community initially viewed these changes with skepticism. Western governments and multinational corporations had grown accustomed to dealing with African leaders who could be bought, intimidated, or manipulated. President Traoré's insistence on transparent, equitable partnerships disrupted established patterns of exploitation. But gradually, even skeptical observers had to acknowledge the results. Burkina Faso's economy grew steadily, political violence decreased, and the country became a model for stable democratic governance in a region plagued by conflict and instability. The story of the mysterious woman and her gifts began to spread throughout West Africa, carried by traders, travelers, and pilgrims who visited Ouagadougou. In markets from Dakar to Lagos, people spoke in whispers about the president who received divine warnings through a magical stone, who consulted with spirits before making important decisions, who had somehow managed to resist the corrupting influence of power. Some dismissed these stories as folklore or propaganda. Others saw them as evidence of a deeper truth about the connection between spiritual awareness and effective leadership. But regardless of how they interpreted the tales, people throughout the region began to pay attention to what was happening in Burkina Faso. Young political activists in other countries started organizing discussion groups focused on the Traoré model of governance. University students wrote dissertations on the integration of traditional African spirituality with modern democratic institutions. Religious leaders incorporated themes of political integrity and servant leadership into their sermons and teachings. More significantly, several other African leaders began to adopt similar practices. The president of Ghana instituted regular consultations with traditional chiefs and religious leaders. The prime minister of Senegal began each cabinet meeting with a moment of silent reflection and prayer. The president of Mali established an ethics council composed of elders from various ethnic and religious communities. Not all of these initiatives were successful. Some leaders tried to copy the external forms of Traoré's approach without understanding or embracing its spiritual foundation. Others used the rhetoric of traditional wisdom to justify authoritarian practices that had nothing to do with genuine servant leadership. But in several cases, the results were genuinely transformative. Countries that had been mired in corruption and instability began to experience the same kind of positive changes that had occurred in Burkina Faso. Foreign observers started to take notice of what some called the African Renaissance, a continent-wide movement toward more ethical, effective governance. The old woman's message was spreading far beyond the borders of any single nation. 7 years after the mysterious woman's first visit, President Traoré faced his greatest challenge yet. A coalition of foreign powers, frustrated by their inability to control or manipulate his government, orchestrated a comprehensive campaign to destabilize Burkina Faso and remove him from power. The attack came from multiple directions simultaneously. Economic sanctions were imposed based on fabricated human rights violations. Neighboring countries, under pressure from their own foreign sponsors, began supporting rebel groups operating along Burkina Faso's borders. International media launched a coordinated disinformation campaign portraying President Traoré as a dictator and religious extremist. Provocateurs organized demonstrations and riots designed to create the impression of widespread popular unrest. For the first time since receiving the old woman's gifts, President Traoré felt genuinely overwhelmed by the scope and intensity of the challenges facing his government. The stone in his pocket remained white, indicating that his physical safety was not in immediate danger, but that provided little comfort when his entire political position was under assault. It was during this dark period that he experienced the most profound spiritual encounter of his presidency. He was praying alone in his study, kneeling on the familiar prayer mat and seeking guidance for how to respond to the mounting crisis, when the room filled with a presence unlike anything he had experienced before. The old woman appeared, but she was not alone. Behind her stood a gathering of figures, men and women of various ages and ethnicities, all wearing simple clothes, but carrying themselves with unmistakable dignity and authority. President Traoré somehow understood that he was seeing the spiritual representatives of Africa's greatest leaders throughout history: kings and queens, prophets and healers, warriors and peacemakers, who had guided their people through times of trial and transformation. "You are not fighting this battle alone," the old woman said, her voice echoing with the authority of centuries. "Every African leader who has ever chosen integrity over corruption, service over self-interest, spiritual wisdom over worldly cleverness, they stand with you now." One of the figures, a tall man wearing the traditional robes of a West African king, stepped forward. "The forces arrayed against you are ancient," he said, in a voice that seemed to come from the earth itself. "They are the same powers that enslaved our people, colonized our continent, and continue to exploit our resources. They fear what you represent because you have shown that African leaders can govern with both strength and righteousness." A woman wearing a simple dress of a healer added her voice. "But their weapons are not stronger than our wisdom. Their money is not more powerful than our unity. Their lies cannot overcome our truth." The old woman spoke again. "The time has come for you to trust not just in the stone's warnings, but in the power of your people's faith. Call upon them not as subjects to be protected, but as partners in the struggle for liberation. Let them see the true nature of the battle that is being fought, and they will rise to meet it." As the vision faded, President Traoré understood what he needed to do. The next morning, President Traoré appeared on national television and radio for what he announced would be the most important speech of his presidency. Instead of speaking from his official office or a formal podium, he chose to address the nation from the courtyard of the palace, standing in the same place where the old woman had once waited patiently for an audience. "My fellow Burkinabé, I come before you today not as your president, but as your brother, to speak about a battle that is being fought for the soul of our nation and the future of our continent." He went on to explain, with complete transparency, the nature of the forces arrayed against Burkina Faso. He detailed the economic manipulation, the foreign interference, the disinformation campaigns, and the attempts to turn the people against their own government. But most importantly, he shared his understanding of why these attacks were occurring. "They fear us," he said, "not because we are weak, but because we are strong, not because we have failed, but because we have succeeded. We have shown that an African nation can govern itself with integrity, can make decisions based on the needs of its people rather than the demands of foreign corporations, can maintain its independence while building positive relations with the rest of the world." He paused, looking directly into the camera with the same intensity that had once impressed foreign diplomats and intimidated political opponents. "But this battle cannot be won by government alone. It requires every citizen, every family, every community to choose between the easy path of surrender and the difficult path of resistance. It requires us to remember who we are and what we stand for." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours of the speech, spontaneous demonstrations of support began appearing throughout the country. Not organized protests or political rallies, but organic expressions of solidarity that seemed to emerge from the very soil of the nation. In Ouagadougou, thousands of people gathered in the central square not to demand anything from their government, but to declare their commitment to defending it. In rural villages, traditional chiefs convened councils of elders to discuss how their communities could contribute to the resistance against foreign manipulation. Religious leaders from all faiths, Muslim, Christian, and traditional African religions, issued joint statements condemning the attacks on their nation's sovereignty. Perhaps most remarkably, the international African diaspora began to mobilize in support of President Traoré's government. African communities in Europe, North America, and other parts of the world organized boycotts of companies involved in the economic sanctions, lobbied their host governments to stop supporting the destabilization campaign, and used social media to counter the disinformation being spread about Burkina Faso. The stone in President Traoré's pocket remained white throughout this period, but he noticed that it seemed to pulse with a different kind of energy, not the warning heat of danger, but the warm glow of confirmation that he was on the right path. The international coalition that had expected to crush President Traoré's government within months found themselves facing something they had not anticipated: a genuine popular movement that transcended politics and touched the deepest sources of African identity and pride. The economic sanctions, instead of weakening Burkina Faso, prompted the development of new trade relationships with other African countries and emerging economies that were eager to demonstrate their independence from Western economic dominance. The negative media coverage backfired as international observers began to investigate the claims being made and discovered the extent of the disinformation campaign. Most significantly, the attempts to isolate Burkina Faso failed as other African governments, inspired by the example of successful resistance, began to adopt similar policies of economic independence and spiritual grounding in governance. Within 2 years, the Burkina Faso model had spread to more than a dozen African countries. A new generation of leaders emerged who combined modern education with traditional wisdom, who consulted with both technical experts and spiritual advisors, who understood that effective governance required both practical competence and moral authority. The old woman's vision of an African Renaissance was becoming reality, but not in the way that outside observers might have expected. This was not a return to pre-colonial political structures or a rejection of modern technology and global engagement. Instead, it was a synthesis that combined the best of both traditions, the efficiency and scope of modern governance with the wisdom and integrity of traditional African leadership. Universities throughout Africa began offering courses in integral leadership that studied the integration of spiritual practices with public administration. Business schools developed curricula focused on ethical entrepreneurship and community-centered economic development. Medical schools started incorporating traditional healing knowledge alongside modern medical training. The changes were not limited to the academic world. Throughout the continent, a new generation of entrepreneurs emerged who were committed to building businesses that served their communities rather than just maximizing profits. Artists and writers began creating works that celebrated African values and wisdom rather than imitating Western cultural forms. Religious leaders from different traditions started working together on social justice initiatives and conflict resolution projects. 10 years after the mysterious woman's first appearance at the palace gates, President Traoré stood once again in his private study, holding the white stone and reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought him to this moment. Burkina Faso had not only survived the attempts to destroy it, but had become a beacon of hope for the entire continent. The stone had saved his life multiple times, warning him of dangers both physical and political, but its greatest gift had been teaching him to trust in sources of wisdom that transcended human understanding. The prayer mat had become more than just a place for Islamic prayers. It had become a symbol of the humility that must characterize all authentic leadership. The cloth woven by widows had reminded him daily that true authority comes from service to those who have suffered. As he contemplated these gifts, President Traoré realized that the old woman's final prophecy was coming true. He was no longer just the president of Burkina Faso. He had become a symbol of what African leadership could be when it remained connected to its spiritual roots and committed to the welfare of its people. Young people throughout Africa were studying his example, not because they wanted to copy his specific policies or practices, but because they wanted to understand how to integrate traditional wisdom with modern challenges. Political science students were writing dissertations on the Traoré doctrine of governance. Leadership development programs were incorporating spiritual disciplines alongside technical training. But perhaps most importantly, the story of the mysterious woman and her gifts had taken on a life of its own. Throughout Africa, people told variations of the tale. Sometimes the leader was a president, sometimes a traditional king, sometimes a community organizer or business leader. Sometimes the gifts were different. A staff that glowed in the presence of lies, a mirror that revealed people's true intentions, a ring that grew tight when the wearer was being selfish. The details varied, but the core message remained consistent. True leadership requires spiritual awareness, moral integrity, and the humility to seek guidance from sources beyond oneself. Power without prayer is dangerous. Authority without accountability is corrupting. Strength without service is ultimately weakness. In markets and universities, in churches and mosques, in corporate boardrooms and village councils, people throughout Africa were learning to ask different questions about their leaders and about themselves. Not just are they competent, but are they humble? Not just can they deliver results, but do they serve something greater than their own interests? Not just are they strong, but are they wise? President Traoré understood that his own role in this transformation was both crucial and temporary. He had been chosen to demonstrate what was possible. But the real work of building a new model of African leadership would be carried out by countless others who had caught the vision and made it their own. The old woman had told him that he would see her in every elder who offered wisdom, hear her voice in every sincere prayer, feel her presence whenever integrity was chosen over convenience. As the years passed, he came to understand that she had spoken literally. The mysterious figure who had appeared at his palace gates was not just an individual person, but the embodiment of African wisdom itself, ancient, eternal, and always available to those with eyes to see and ears to hear. Standing in his study on this quiet evening, President Traoré felt a deep sense of gratitude and responsibility. The stone in his hand remained white and cool, indicating that his immediate safety was secure. But more than that, it had become a symbol of the vigilance that every leader must maintain, not just against external enemies, but against the internal corruption that power inevitably brings. He placed the stone on his desk next to the prayer mat and the cloth, then knelt for his evening prayers. As he bowed his head in submission to the divine, he offered thanks for the gifts he had received and asked for continued guidance in the work that lay ahead. Outside his window, the lights of Ouagadougou twinkled like stars, each one representing a life, a family, a dream for the future. Beyond the capital, the vast expanse of Burkina Faso stretched towards the horizon. Villages and farms, schools and clinics, markets and workshops, all part of the nation he had been called to serve. And beyond Burkina Faso, the continent of Africa spread in all directions. 1 billion people, 54 nations, countless languages and cultures, all part of the great human family that the old woman had represented when she walked through his palace gates with nothing but truth to offer. The stone of mercy had saved one man's life, but its deeper purpose was to help birth a new vision of what Africa could become when its leaders remembered who they were and whom they served. The prayer mat had provided comfort in times of crisis, but its greater gift was the daily reminder that true strength comes from surrender to something greater than oneself. The cloth woven by widows had been beautiful to behold, but its real value lay in the prayers and hopes it carried, the dreams of ordinary people for leaders who would govern with compassion and wisdom. As President Traoré concluded his evening prayers and prepared to rest, he reflected on the words the old woman had spoken during their first encounter. Power is heavy, but it becomes dangerous when carried with pride. Those words had guided him through every challenge, every decision, every moment when the temptation to abuse authority had presented itself. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new opportunities to serve. The stone would continue to warn him of dangers. The prayer mat would continue to remind him of his dependence on divine guidance. And the cloth would continue to carry the hopes and prayers of his people. But tonight, he could rest in the knowledge that the seeds of transformation had been planted not just in Burkina Faso, but throughout Africa. The mysterious woman's mission had been accomplished. Her gifts had found their purpose, and her vision of spiritual leadership was becoming reality in ways that would continue to unfold for generations to come. In villages throughout the continent, elders told the story of the woman in rags who saved a nation. In cities, young professionals incorporated spiritual practices into their daily routines. In government offices, civil servants remembered that their work was a form of service to something greater than themselves. The stone of mercy had become more than a gift to one leader. It had become a symbol of the awakening that was transforming Africa from within. And like all truly divine gifts, its power grew not through being hoarded, but through being shared, not through being protected, but through being given freely to all who had eyes to see and hearts to receive. The old woman's work was complete, but her legacy would continue forever, not in monuments or museums, but in every act of integrity, every moment of humility, every choice to serve rather than to be served. She had walked quietly through the gates of power and left behind the keys to transformation. Whether those keys would be used wisely would depend on each new generation of leaders who chose to pick them up and carry them forward. The stone of mercy pulsed gently on the president's desk, white as moonlight, patient as wisdom, eternal as truth itself.